You know how it is. You want to stay informed, really get a handle on these big, complicated issues, but honestly, the amount of information flying around can just be overwhelming.
It really can.
That's where we come in. This is the deep dive, and today we're really zeroing in on this escalating trade situation between the U.S. and China.
Right.
You sent us some really interesting stuff, transcripts from two different YouTube perspectives, and our job, well, it's to cut through that noise, pull out the crucial bits you need to understand what's really going on.
Exactly. And the sources you share, they give us a valuable look from, different angles. We've got CBC News, the National covering China's recent tariff hikes, and the immediate reactions, including some, well, pretty colorful stuff from Chinese media.
Yeah, I saw that.
And then there's a segment from MSNBC's Trump's First 100 Days, which has some expert analysis on the bigger picture, the escalating tensions.
Okay, so let's just jump right in. What we're basically looking at is a full-blown trade war. And it's heating up fast, isn't it, between the U.S. and China?
It is.
Both sides are hitting each other with steeper and steeper tariffs. And look, this isn't just some abstract economic thing. This could ripple through everything, potentially hitting the prices you pay, for everyday stuff and the whole economic picture.
That's absolutely right. The latest move in this trade fight saw the U.S. hike tariffs on Chinese goods, bringing them up to, 145%?
Right.
And China, well, they didn't waste any time hitting back, raising their tariffs on American goods to a really significant 125%.
So tit for tat?
Exactly. This tit-for-tat escalation is really key here. And what's fascinating isn't just the numbers. I mean, they're huge, but it's what they mean. Levels like these basically make trade in a lot of areas, well, unprofitable.
Yeah.
Businesses have to seriously rethink everything.
Their whole supply chains, yeah. And it's not just the tariffs, is it? The CBC report, it highlighted how China's framing the U.S. actions as economic bullying. They've even rolled out some, really creative tactics. AI-generated videos and images. I mean, one video apparently showed struggling American workers trying to make stuff China makes now. Wow.
And another was like a sci-fi thing with a robot named Tariff causing chaos in the U.S., job losses, higher costs.
Seriously. A robot named Tariff.
Yeah. And then there was this AI image from, I think, the Chinese Foreign Ministry, seemed designed to directly mock President Trump, suggest a high price for Americans because of these tariffs. It really shows this isn't just economics. There's a big information war happening, too.
Absolutely. That use of media, it's striking. These AI visuals, they're not just for kicks. They're, carefully designed to shape opinion in China, push a narrative about how damaging this trade war is for the U.S. It's a mix of economic pressure and strategic messaging.
Yeah, propaganda, basically. Did the sources say anything about how well that's working domestically or, internationally?
That's a really good question. The sources didn't give us hard data on effectiveness, but the fact that official channels are pushing this stuff out, it suggests they think it resonates, at least with their target audience.
Right, makes sense. Okay, so what about the official positions? What are the main messages coming from both sides right now? Well, from the U.S. side, President Trump, he's been publicly optimistic about getting a deal with China. He even posted on social media saying the U.S. is doing really well with the tariff policy, calling it very exciting for America and the world.
Okay.
But at the same time, his message is also really firm. If the U.S. gets punched, he'll punch back harder. That's the quote. All supposedly to get a deal that helps American workers and companies. It's a theme we've seen before, hasn't it? Tariffs as a big negotiating stick.
Yeah, definitely. And his team seems to be echoing that optimism. Caroline Leavitt on MSNBC mentioned the White House view is basically that China needs the U.S. economy, so they'll have to come to the table eventually, right, for a deal.
That seems to be the line.
Even though there's apparently no actual talks happening right now, seems like a bit of a gamble, doesn't it? Assuming the other side will just fold without direct talks.
It is a gamble. It suggests they believe the economic pain alone will be enough to force China's hand. But, if you connect this to the pattern, it's consistent Trump rhetoric belief in tariffs, focus on perceived unfair trade. The optimism relies on China needing the U.S. market more than they want to resist the pressure.
Meanwhile, China's painting a totally different picture. Their officials are saying these tariff levels could basically bring trade to a standstill. They're saying they just can't absorb much higher tariffs. But at the same time, they're just as adamant they will not back down. Not against what they see as unfair pressure. It really feels like a clash of wills.
It really does. And President Xi Jinping's warning, no winners in a trade war, and that going against the world will only lead to self-isolation, that really sums up China's official line. He's stressing China's self-reliance, saying they don't fear unjust suppression. It suggests they're prepared to take the economic hit rather than give in on what they see as core issues.
Yeah.
So, based on these reports, who do you think has more on the line here, maintaining their stance?
Oh, that's tough. I mean, on one hand, the U.S. is this huge market China has relied on. Losing that access, that's a massive blow.
Definitely.
But on the other hand, China's leadership seems really set on projecting strength, not being pushed around. Maybe they think caving now just invites more pressure later.
That could be the calculation.
Now, this isn't just about the U.S. and China, is it? This whole thing is causing ripples everywhere. How are other big economies reacting? What about the EU?
Exactly. The European Union, they've voiced concerns. They're warning that if the U.S. doesn't back off these tariffs, they'll have to defend our economy too, maybe bring in their own contravailing measures.
Right.
It just shows how interconnected everything is. A fight between giants like the U.S. and China. It doesn't happen in a bubble. Everyone feels the effects.
No doubt. Okay, turning back to the U.S. impacts, that University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index.
Wow.
Wow. It took a serious nosedive.
Yeah, lowest since the pandemic. Second lowest since, what, 1952?
Yeah, way back. That's a pretty clear sign of how Americans are feeling about the economy right now. People expect higher unemployment, rising prices, and what really jumped out at me was that this drop wasn't just like one party. Democrats, Republicans, independent sentiment fell sharply across the board. Suggests a kind of general unease, doesn't it?
It really does. That index, it reflects confidence, right? How people feel about the economy.
Yeah.
A drop like that, plus expecting higher prices because tariffs could hike out, import costs, it signals real worry about their own finances, their future buying power, and the fact it's across party lines. That shows broad concern about where things are headed.
And from China's side, their officials are pretty blunt. They're basically saying, with these new tariffs, U.S. goods are no longer commercially viable in their market. That sounds pretty final.
It does. I mean, 125% tariff, it just prices U.S. goods out for most things.
Yeah.
Lorianne LaRocco on MSNBC, she pointed out that while soybeans, agriculture, that was always a key target.
Right, always the soybeans.
But now the impact is much wider. Pharmaceuticals, electronics, oil, gas, coal, and China's already shown it can find other suppliers, right, like getting soybeans from Russia instead. So U.S. producers in these areas face losing a massive market.
And Shannon O'Neill from the Council on Foreign Relations, she made a really crucial point. She said ever since those first U.S. tariffs back in 2018, China's been systematically, kind of quietly diversifying who they trade with. They now actually trade more with Southeast Asia and other emerging markets than they do with the U.S. and Europe combined. Makes you think these new tariffs might just push that even faster.
That's a fascinating angle, China's proactive shift. The U.S. is still huge, yeah, buys around $460 billion of Chinese goods a year.
Yeah.
But China's actively working to rely less on the U.S., building stronger ties elsewhere. This sort of delinking has been happening for a while.
So the tariffs accelerate it?
Likely, yes. So the key takeaway isn't just the tariffs themselves, but that these actions are nudging China further down that diversification path, potentially reshaping global trade patterns in the long run.
So yeah, the tariffs will definitely hurt China economically, but they're not totally stuck. O'Neill thinks they'll probably double down on boosting trade with the EU, Asia, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, everywhere else, basically.
It's a strategy, right? Building resilience against trade pressure. But like you said, it's not a quick fix, is it?
No, definitely not.
No, it's a long game for China. They know it hurts now, but they're betting they can find other markets, expand globally over time. And this also points to the different political systems. Like O'Neill said, President Xi, he doesn't face the same immediate election pressures a U.S. president might. That gives him more room to absorb economic pain for these longer-term goals.
Okay, so looking ahead, what might happen next? Tyler Page from the New York Times mentioned how hard it is to predict President Trump's next move on tariffs, given his track record of, well, changing his mind.
Yeah, unpredictable.
One idea floated out there was the U.S. maybe trying to cut China off from the international banking system. That sounds extreme.
It would be incredibly extreme. Hugely disruptive. Kicking a major economy off the system, restricting their access to global finance. It's so complex because everything's interconnected. It could trigger massive retaliation, instability.
So probably not likely soon.
Well, it's a theoretical tool the U.S. could use, but the potential chaos makes it less probable in the near term. As Tyler Page noted, the main goal seems to be isolating China economically, right?
Right. And the NYT also mentioned worries inside the Trump administration that maybe Japan and South Korea could start cozying up more to China because of these tariffs. That would definitely shake things up geopolitically.
Oh, absolutely. Unilateral trade moves can backfire on diplomacy, on alliances. The worry that key U.S. allies in Asia might drift towards China. That highlights the tricky balance here. And that recent meeting, the one between economic ministers from China, Japan, and South Korea, apparently unprecedented, that's a real sign of international nervousness, maybe new alignments forming because of these trade tensions.
China holding a lot of U.S. Treasury bonds was also brought up.
Mm.
Potential leverage, right? If they started selling off big chunks, that could rattle financial markets. We saw some volatility already this week.
That's a critical point, yeah. China is one of the biggest holders of U.S. debt. Any large-scale sell-offs could push U.S. interest rates up, destabilize markets even more. That financial interdependence just adds another layer of complexity to the whole trade fight.
Okay, let's shift to domestic politics here in the U.S. Early polls suggest most Americans aren't happy with President Trump's handling of the economy right now.
Hmm.
But you have to remember his first term, right? Those farm sectors hit by trade disputes got massive bailouts, financial relief. Could that be why some Americans still expect things to work out, that Trump will pull off a good deal again?
That memory of relief payments could definitely play a role in how people see it. But the scale now, the scope of these tariffs, it's much bigger. Hits way more sectors, more consumers potentially. So while some might hope for a good outcome eventually, worries are growing, especially, among some in Congress looking ahead to the 2026 midterms, thinking about the potential economic damage.
Yeah, raises a big question. Can the administration find a deal that maybe involves the U.S. giving some ground? And how would that even play politically?
That is the million-dollar question. President Trump's whole image is tied to being strong, not backing down. A deal where the U.S. concedes something. That could be a really tough sell politically, even if it made economic sense.
Yeah, really tough.
Precisely. But as Tyler Page pointed out, President Trump is very skilled at messaging. He'll likely keep support within the Republican Party for his general approach, at least for a while. The bigger challenge might just be the real-world impact: higher prices, maybe job losses hitting consumers.
Okay, let's zoom in specifically on China's potential pain here. Shannon O'Neill was clear. A full-on trade war shuts them out of the world's biggest consumer market. For an export-heavy economy like theirs, that's a huge hit.
Massive.
And it's happening when China's already dealing with internal economic problems, real estate issues, weak consumer spending.
Right. Losing the U.S. market would definitely make China's existing economic problems worse. Their export surge over last year was meant to help, but losing a buyer like the U.S. leaves a big hole. But, like we said, their strategy of diversifying trade provides a buffer, a potential path forward, even if it's maybe slower growth than before.
And the political system gives Xi more leeway.
Likely, yes. With power consolidated, he probably has more flexibility to manage the economic pain without facing immediate voter backlash like a leader in a democracy might.
Right. Now, switching back to the broader economy, that MSNBC discussion, it painted a pretty grim picture of sentiment here in the U.S. Consumer sentiment plunging, inflation expectations highest since '81, unemployment fears highest since '09. Someone actually used the word petrified to describe consumers. That really hits home the level of anxiety this trade war is creating for ordinary people, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Those are deeply worrying signs. Inflation fears and unemployment fears rising together. That screams major economic anxiety among consumers. And it's striking because it comes not that long after an election where cost of living was such a huge issue.
And Wall Street seems stuck, right? They see the potential downsides of the tariffs, but seem afraid to criticize Trump directly, fear of retaliation.
That's what's suggested.
There was even that report about a top JP Morgan analyst maybe holding back critical analysis because of those fears. That points to a kind of chilling effect on open economic discussion, doesn't it? Maybe a wider crisis of confidence.
Exactly. When analysts feel they have to self-censor out of fear, it damages the honest risk assessment markets need. And yeah, that could spill into the bond market. Global investors start questioning U.S. Treasury stability because policy is so unpredictable. Seeing stocks and bonds both fall, that's a really bad sign. Yeah. Bonds are usually the safe place to hide.
Makes it more expensive for the U.S. to borrow money, too.
Right. And the risk that big holders of U.S. debt, like China, might sell off during a trade war. That becomes a very real systemic risk.
The MSNBC panel basically argued this mess is self-made. driven by these trade policies, pointing to how markets jump around on any rumor of de-escalation.
Mm.
And the contrast between Trump's, sometimes shifting statements and his team trying to present a clear plan that seems to be eroding confidence, too.
That lack of a clear, steady strategy creates huge uncertainty for businesses, for investors, leads to more market swings. And the apparent gap between the president's view of trade deficits and, well, basic economics that complicates things, potentially hurts actual negotiations.
The point was also made that maybe working with allies, a multilateral approach, might be better for tackling unfair trade than just slapping on unilateral tariffs.
A very different approach, yes. And it's worth remembering, past trade deals like USMCA, they took ages, like 18 months to sort out. Cast doubt on any quick fix here. All this just fuels the worry about higher costs for consumers, for businesses, because these tariffs basically act like a tax.
Okay, finally, just a quick mention of a couple of other worrying points from the sources. Reports of federal spending actually going up under this administration compared to last year, despite talk of saving money.
Right, that was mentioned.
And then those really unsettling reports about federal workers at some agencies being warned about potential monitoring, communications being watched by something called DOGE, using AI to look for disloyalty or keywords.
Yeah.
Created a lot of anxiety, apparently, even though the White House denied it.
Those things definitely add to the overall feeling of uncertainty. Higher government spending raises fiscal questions, especially now. And those monitoring allegations, even denied, could create a climate of fear, maybe stop people in government from speaking up or raising valid concerns.
So look, to wrap this all up for you, the listener, it's clear this trade war between the U.S. and China is escalating fast. This isn't just news headlines, it's real. It's creating economic uncertainty, hitting consumers with price worries and unemployment fears, and stirring up complex politics internationally. These are real issues with likely real-world effects for you down the line.
Which brings us to a final thought, something for you to chew on. Given how fast things are escalating, the totally different views from the U.S. and China, what's happening and what might happen, and the nervousness we're seeing globally, what long-term strategies might both countries actually pursue? And, maybe more importantly, how will wider global economic forces shape how this whole conflict plays out? It's definitely a time to think critically about how interconnected our world is and how these big policy moves can have consequences nobody fully predicts.